Good evening, everybody. It's so nice to see so many of you here to kind of really celebrate the music of Clara Schumann. We're so happy to be having this series of 3 events. We had a film last night that had featured Sting and his wife Trudy Styler reading letters between Robert and Clara to each other, and with some interspersed with some performances. That was a very nice evening. Tonight we have a performance featuring only Clara Schumann's music and representing pretty much every type of music that she wrote, with a couple of exceptions that I'll explain why we're not doing that. For instance, the piano concerto was not represented here today because we don't have an orchestra here. We'll be talking mostly about tonight and this pre-concert talk, mostly about the music that we're going to be hearing tonight, but also a few other pieces just to give you a little bit of context about the scope of Clara's work. Tomorrow morning, my colleague Kate Miller of the Music Division will be doing a declassified presentation, which is a term we use for these kind of more informal but informative events that will be in this room, where we'll have a lot of the library's Clara Schumann materials out on display. And she'll speak about what we have and then be able to show you those things. So I won't be going too much into the details of what we actually have at the library, because she'll be doing that tomorrow. So I hope you're able to come to that as well if you're interested. So I thought we'd start with, ultimately we're going to be focusing on primarily the piano music of Clara Schumann, because that's primarily what she wrote. She did write a number of wonderful lieder, several of which we're going to get to hear tonight, and we will get to those as well today. But it makes sense that she wrote most of her music was for piano, because she was one of the great pianists of the 19th century, as many of you I'm sure know. She had something like a 60-year performance career, and had a huge impact across Europe on programming for recitals, instruction, all kinds of things. Editing, she contributed in lots of different ways. But up until about 1839, a lot of that, those details of that's when she went to Paris alone, a lot of those details were managed by her father, Friedrich Wieck. Her father was a pedagogue and kind of a very strict, authoritarian kind of figure in her life, but also one whose opinion she greatly respected and worked with to try to please, and in some ways, helped to forge her into the virtuosa that she was. It's complicated, of course, because the details of her relationship with Robert Schumann are very much tied up with this relationship with Friedrich Wieck, because Friedrich Wieck, in the end, did not like Robert Schumann, and so there was a very prolonged and acrimonious time before they could actually get together. When Robert and Clara first met, it was around 1830. She was 11. Don't worry, things didn't start right then, but it took a little bit of time for that to come about. But I'm not going to focus on that as much as well either, just because that biographical component is extremely complicated and interesting, but kind of beyond the scope of what we're doing here. However, that being said, you can't really talk about Clara Schumann's music without talking about Robert's as well. I don't mean in the sense of wanting to dive into analyses of their music, but rather to look at the types of relationships that they built into their music. Some of it was very personal, things that they didn't expect necessarily others to know, things that would be references that would be immediately obvious to them and not so much to us. Back then, of course, they didn't have the benefit of being able to go online and just listen to all these little clips and make these connections that we have right now. So there would be no expectation that a listener would be able to make some certain types of obscure references. So, I mean, this is a bit speculative in terms of how much they wanted this to be for public consumption, but you can kind of imagine that a lot of these were kind of private types of intersections between them. I do want to say that some of the things I'm going to be talking about are quotation, and some of them are going to be just more kind of general references. What I'm not going to be putting forward is the idea that Robert wrote her music or in any way had a greater role than might be appropriate for his role as somebody whose opinion she respected. There are a couple of cases where it appears that he did have a greater role, like for instance in the piano concerto and a few other things, but mostly in terms of orchestration in that case. But there are one criticism that happened contemporaneously in the 19th century, especially with the trio that you're going to hear tonight, was that there's no way that a woman could have written this. And so this is something that we push back against very strongly now, thankfully, and so that's why I want to make clear that any reference that I'm making to Robert's role in her music is very much a referential one as opposed to a interference type of role. And there's also many instances where it's not clear whose idea is what and who is actually quoting whom. So that's kind of one of the fun things about getting to know some of this music. So let's start with some of the early music of Clara Schumann. When she's coming up in the 1830s, it's in the world of the Parisian virtuoso, where you have people like Pixis, Thalberg, Hertz, all these other people who are extremely flashy pianists. I personally have nothing against their music. I think it's interesting and should be looked at again now, but at the time it was seen as a complete opposite, and I mean it's still seen as a complete opposite thing from, like, say, a Beethoven sonata or a Bach prelude and fugue. This is not the kind of thing that you would be seriously studying, but it was exactly the kind of thing that you would be performing to bring in the crowds. And so it makes perfect sense that some of her earliest music would fit into this mold of the type of music that was being done at the time. One of the interesting things is that from this very early stage, you already have this interesting relationship between Robert and Clara, because both of them were writing their Opus 2s at the same time while they were living in the same house. Because Robert was a boarder with Friedrich Wieck. And so people might know the Robert Schumann piece a bit better than this caprices in the form of a waltz that we have here, Clara. Robert's Opus 2 was the Papillon. And just as an example, I'd like you just to hear the very opening of it. And I think you'll see what I mean, that there is something shared in the air. So here's the Clara Schumann. Okay, and keep in mind this is the work of a 12, 13-year-old. And so this is from Robert Schumann's Papillon. This is after the introduction, this is the first number.
How old was he at this stage?
22. So what I've done is I've highlighted here in red the kinds of things that you're just seeing there that are those upward scales that are very similar and very clear to the ear. I'm not saying that there's any greater relationship between these things, but it's kind of one of those interesting confluences that I think is not coincidental that was happening there. So I said this is kind of sharing flowers with the butterflies and whatnot, so that's my... I've got some hilarious ones tonight. You guys are gonna... But then we go from this, so her Opus 1 is a set of 4 polonaises that are written by an 11-year-old who is getting started with this, and they're actually quite passable pieces for a young composer. I think she felt that they were maybe published prematurely, but this was also at the urging of her father. There's this strange, at this early stage, there's this strange push for her to be composing as a pianist and also improvising and things like that to get, because that's what one did as a virtuoso pianist. But that, of course, was pushed back upon as she got older because of her being a woman and then starting a family and all those types of things. Those pressures kind of started to constrict and disallow some of the opportunities that she would have, I think, liked to have had and liked to have continued having. But what we notice is within the space of 2 or 3 years, there's this quite a big, it's quite a big jump that happens in terms of the, I think, in terms of just the quality and the thoughtfulness of the writing that she's doing. She's still very young, teenager. Some of these are written when she's between 13 to 16 years old. But she's suddenly got this command, and I think that this comes through in a lot of her music through her performance practice. There's something about if you're just a composer, it takes a lot of practice to write. You have to write, and eventually maybe you'll get something that's okay. But if you're a performer and somebody who's actively playing lots of different types of music, there's often this sense of, or in cases where you have a very great musical mind, like in Clara's case, almost like an osmotic process thing that happens where she's able to just jump in and create more swiftly than I think somebody who's not a performer at that level. That's speculative, but that's just a sense that I have from this. So one of the pieces that you'll hear tonight, there's a set of 4 pieces, character pieces, and we're going to hear. There's an early version that was the version we're going to hear was called Impromptu, Le Sabbat, like the Sabbath, the Witch's Sabbath, and it was eventually republished in 1838 as Hexentanz, so Witch's Dance. And so we're going to hear that one tonight. And it's one of, there were a bunch of people who were very into this set of works by Clara, including Mendelssohn and Spohr, so it's kind of a good group of people to have in your corner in terms of appreciating what you're doing as a teenager. So we'll hear that, but then there's this other set called the Soirée Musicale, which is a set of 6 pieces, unrelated except for one big relationship that comes through, that becomes kind of a musical entree of sorts and a greater, introduces a greater relationship between her and Robert in terms of their sharing of musical ideas across what it is that they're doing. So this set, like I said, it's 6 pieces. What we're going to hear tonight are 3 of them. The Toccatina, which is like a little toccata at the beginning, followed by a notturno, which is very much a nocturne in the style of Chopin, who became a friend of Clara and Robert. Depending on how much time we have, I think I'll still show you an example of what this sounds like. But one of the things that you'll start to notice is that when I play an example here, there are certain things that she does that just show a great sense of what can happen if you play with the registers and little tiny techniques that are not so hard to play, but make a big difference sonic-wise, and they just sound like much more sophisticated, even in the context of a toccata. So I'd like to play, just to give you an example, a little bit of the Hexentanz, followed by a little bit of the Toccatina. With the Hexentanz, we know that was already on programs of hers by the 1834. So even though it wasn't published until later, so that it's an early work. So these little things that I boxed there are just these little ideas that pop out and just make for not just showier, but also just a sonically more vivid type of impression that I think happens in the toccattina. It's a great piece. These are all great pieces that you're going to hear tonight. They could easily be repertoire pieces if people would just play them. So we're very pleased that we have Anne-Marie McDermott playing these tonight. So interestingly, some relationships start to come in between Clara's pieces and between Clara and Robert. And so the first relationship that I'm going to point out, but not necessarily be able to show, is that top example that you see here, where there's kind of a descending scale followed by an octave leap from F to F. It's in that blue box. This F sharp to F sharp, that is mirrored in the notturno, which is the second piece. So there's this theme that's introduced in kind of a more calm section of the toccattina that then comes into play in the notturno. I point this out because that theme is then used by Robert Schumann in the Novelletten, Opus 21, the 8th number of that set. And here it is, he labels it, in his version it was the Stimme aus der Ferne, so it was voice from afar would be a good way to put that. And you can see that I put it in blue above the notturno setting, that's Clara's notturno, and you can see that he's very clearly, hopefully it's clear, that he's even to the point of using the turn at the bottom before the octave leap, presenting the same basic material. So after he includes this in that piano piece, he actually continues to, he doesn't just quote it, he continues to develop it in different ways, and you can see how he does this as just one example where he keeps going with that turn and uses it to further develop that idea in that piece. I'm just going to give you a little sense of these relationships now, but before I do that, and I'll try to remind you of what I'm talking about in a second, before I do that, I just want to point out that this is not just your standard nocturne piece. So a lot of people are aware that like John Field was kind of a forerunner of the nocturne genre, and of course Chopin is the best known exponent of that type of thing. But of course, within that, there's a whole range of types of music that are there. Some of it quite dramatic, some of it lyrical, sometimes just a melody with accompaniment. That's what most people think of. But the idea spawned so many copies during the 19th century and beyond. People still write nocturnes. That there's a sense of, let's just say that there's plenty of them that are forgettable. It's easy to write a bad nocturne. This is not in that category. It's very much I find it to be on par with some of the great nocturnes of the 19th century for several reasons, but one of the reasons it comes through is the same thing that I think I was referring to earlier in terms of how her work as a performer carries through into her composition. She would do certain things that create textural effects that are not just effects, but are actually things that are moving and sonically interesting. So one of those is just something as simple as using upper octave grace notes as a way to kind of inflect a melody, and that's what I have in that upper left red box. Then there's this gorgeous expansive type of ornamentation that's in the middle box that you'll hear. I got to hear the rehearsal earlier. You're in for a real treat. And then there's things that are maybe not as obvious on the page, but like the bottom box, where you have embedded sort of alto register, tenor register, melodic ideas within the context of an accompaniment that's already pre-existing. So these things, that may obvious, right? No, but these things sound, the combination of a variety of these types of things in sequence makes for something that's always interesting, always kind of keeping you aware that something special is happening. One last thing about this notturno is that there's other things that, again, are not a typical thing for a composer to do, but for a pianist, even for a pianist composer, this is kind of unusual. You have these tied grace notes that you see in the red box there, with the articulation coming after the fact of the middle voice. It's quite a lovely and interesting effect, and one that you don't find that often. So there's these types of little details, I won't go into a zillion of them, that I think help to make these pieces special. So let me just give you a little bit of an example of this notturno and also the novelette relationship. Here's the beginning of the notturno. These are the pieces that you can't really pause anywhere. Good. Here's Robert Schumann's quotation of it, the voice from afar. So you can see with that quotation that the interesting parts of what he's doing are there in Clara's piece. And so he's taking that and he's doing his own thing with it, but it's very much a reference to her music that is meant for her. This is the, getting near the courting phase here where we're trying to show, hey, I'm aware of what you're doing compositionally, know what I'm saying? That's the kind of thing that they would do back in those days. And so this is, I think it's an interesting type of thing when Robert takes that stuff, or likewise when Clara takes that stuff, or the other's music, they transform it in a way that makes it their own. So it's not just a, if sometimes you might listen to a piece that's like a variations on a work by Mozart or something like that, and you come away thinking, wow, that Mozart was great. So you don't want to have that sort of reaction to to the type of quotation. So where the quotation itself is the thing that you wish that the piece had been. And so this is a case where they really kind of incorporate it into something new and interesting. The last piece from this set that they're going to do, and I'm realizing I need to move it here, is the second Mazurka from Opus 6. You might notice something familiar in those opening lines. And instead of showing it to you, I'll just have you listen at home. And also tonight you'll hear the Mazurka. But the Robert, again, he actually labeled this, the motto is from Clara Wieck in his Davidsbündlertänze, Opus 6. He used that verbatim, that opening of this Mazurka. So there's another case where Clara is inspiring Robert. And there's a more significant one that I'm going to get to in a little bit as well. But this sort of thing, this is the kind of thing that they're, how they're getting to know each other musically. I won't say much about the piano concerto now, just because, again, we're not representing it here tonight, but I will say that it's the one larger work that she completed and had published. There are other So there's a single movement, piano and orchestra work, I think that was completed and recorded. And there's some other small things, but pretty much this is the orchestral offering that we have. Clara Schumann, she performed it, and it was well received. But it's also an early work. And as I mentioned, there was some element of involvement from Robert with that piece that has come to light. I bring up the Opus 8 variations. It's really actually an interesting piece. This is basically an operatic paraphrase in this Parisian style that I was mentioning earlier. I won't play an example of it just due to time, but it's worth listening to. It's about a 15, 16-minute piece, and it's very much in the style of the thing that Robert Schumann would hate and didn't like very much at all. But it's a genre that made the careers of a lot of these pianists, and so it's interesting to see her engaging in it and doing it so successfully. It's a shame that she didn't do more because I think she was very talented with it. But that's another interesting side to what she was doing. She starts to shy away from this sort of a thing. Her Opus 9 is a souvenir of Vienna that's kind of a little bit in the same vein. But she starts to move away from this as Robert's influence becomes greater. And by that I don't mean, again, musical influence, but rather a kind of encouragement to write more serious pieces. We have a very interesting pairing of pieces that come up today, which are the second scherzo. She wrote two. The first one was quite popular in its day, and she played it a lot. The second one, I don't know where the manuscript is. I think it was composed sometime between 1841 and 1845. It matters because, at least to me, because there's a relationship here between this work and one of the pieces that we're going to hear tonight, Eris Gekommen, one of the songs. And so the song cycle, well, I'll get to that in a minute, but it's a little bit hard to see, but there's the clear relationship to me is between the things that are in red and the things that are in blue. So what you'll hear on the first half is you'll hear the scherzo happening first, and it's kind of an instrumental scherzo movement that won't mean anything special yet because it's not clear what its relationship is. But when you hear the song, you might hear this sort of compacted, contracted version of it in a different key, but still using similar materials. You can see that one's using, it's going triple to duple, so it's not exactly the same, but you'll hear the melodies and how they're related. I might give you an example of that. So that's the piano scherzo. And again, Chopin had not published all of his scherzi yet. He had already started doing them, but so it's interesting to think of them in light of the Chopin scherzi also. So this, I think you'll hear those relationships, and it's interesting that she changed the way that she dealt with the material, as one would imagine she would, but it makes it unclear which idea came first and what order she might have done that. It might have been a concurrent type of thing. The other complicating factor is that there's this other relationship between a center. There's a quote, what I think is a quotation in the center of the scherzo that's related to several different things. And let me try to explain this better. a brief diversion to An die ferne Geliebte, Beethoven's song cycle, and a note of caution as well. But there's the sixth song for the set is it's often considered that Robert Schumann quoted this at the end of the first movement of his Opus 17 Fantasy as a reference to his distant beloved Clara. The reason I get a little bit of caution is that there's no contemporaneous, according to Larry Todd, there's no contemporaneous assessment of this until after the turn of the 20th century. So it may well be the case. And in fact, there's enough evidence that Schumann did this multiple times that it probably is correct, but just a word of caution. I've highlighted in blue the things that are related. So the Beethoven song cycle has that line up there, and then the adagio moment at the end of the fantasy, unforgettable. Everybody loves it. When it gets to the scherzo, there's a relationship that I hear here between that center part of the scherzo and and a new version of the An die ferne Geliebte quote. So it's a different setting of it, and I think people have mentioned that there is this component of, in the second symphony, in the fourth movement, a Beethovenian type of theme that comes in that has this relationship to Robert's quotation of An die ferne Geliebte. So it starts to become, if you make enough copies of something, it starts the difference from the original becomes, amplified, right? So this is sort of what's happening here, but there's this moment that I hear in the scherzo that is a version of that symphony version, at least to my ear. So I'm just going to play you an example of that so you can hear what I hear and you can make your own conclusions about it. Here's the Beethoven first, just so you get that. Here's where it is in the fantasy, so you can hear that quote. Now here's this spot in the scherzo, and just bear with me, see if it sounds similar. And then that's it. That's the only appearance of that in the scherzo. So that's the only reference to it. And here's the symphony. So that's incorporated throughout the symphony, and that's I'm not, because it might be a quote of a quote. It's hard to say he wrote it at such and such time, but the date of that the symphony itself comes a bit later, in 1845-6. So there's this interesting kind of sequence of relationships there. I encourage you to go listen to her preludes and fugues. She actually wrote a number of them that were also without opus number, but the opus 16 date from 1845 at a time when she and Robert joined in together to do some counterpoint studies. I love that they did these activities together that were just, I just love that. So they, and she produced these really wonderful preludes and fugues, and worth your time. We're not going to have time to listen to them now, but worth checking out. And just also, not that one needs to demonstrate one's chops in this sense, but they demonstrate that. Also, a piece that we're not going to really get into in detail, just due to time, is the trio that you'll hear tonight. The final movement of the trio in particular shows a degree of contrapuntal mastery that impressed Mendelssohn and others. One of the key works of the evening, and I think of her output, is the Variations on a Theme by Robert Schumann, Opus 20 work. This was based on the first Albumblätter from the Bunte-Blätter, which is not the first of the set, but it's the first of the Albumblätter from that set. Opus 99, collection of kind of colorful leaves of works. So it's a beautiful theme. You'll enjoy it, and then what you'll see is that basically Clara takes a kind of a classical approach to dealing with the theme, but does it in her own way. And what I mean by that is that, by the classical approach, is that there's a sort of written-in rhythmic acceleration that occurs over the course of the variations. So you see like a triplet variation, but you still hear the theme very clearly here in Variation 1. Variation 2, you start to have a little bit of rhythmic differentiation in that theme, but it's still very much there, but she starts to do some more interesting virtuosic things. I should mention that this piece comes in 1853 when she was composing the Opus 21 romances, just about concurrently. The Opus 22 romances for violin and piano that we're also going to hear. We'll also hear Opus 21, and then also the Opus 23 songs, of which we'll hear 2, and of which the library happens to have 1 holograph manuscript of, that my colleague Kate will be able to show you tomorrow. And I think it's on display tonight as well, so you can check that out there. But back to the variations. She starts to do these really just wonderful transformations of turns of phrase that, again, you keep hearing the theme. It's very much intact, but it's dealt with in a way that you're kind of it's a mesmerizing type of piece. The third variation, we get to the major variation there. And one of the things that is interesting about what Clara does is that she's introducing these ideas, including what you might see in the second line there with these sort of oscillating ideas that are going back and forth. They're in the main theme, but she starts to vary the way that she varies it in her coda. So she asks you as a listener to remember what she's been doing, because that itself is meaningful, if that makes sense. We get further acceleration in the fourth variation. We get a kind of a bravura variation with the fifth one with what I think are some interesting octave interspersions, kind of interspersed octaves that are similar to something like one of the Chopin nocturnes, Opus 48, number 1, the C minor, where Chopin will have a theme going and then introduce these other ideas in the midst of it. It's kind of an effective pianistic sort of thing to do, but really well done in the variation set. The sixth variation introduces a sort of canon. We have it, so it starts with that C sharp and then it comes in with the F sharp, but then it switches back to a unison canon in the central section. And this is where that da, 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 like this thing going back and forth becomes a lot clearer in the coda, clearly meaningful in the coda. Then we get to, again, greater acceleration, more flourish, even greater examples of stretching out these central ideas. And then when we get to the coda, there's something really interesting that I didn't know about until I read about this. This is a quote that I did not hear, but now I know it. Basically, Clara decides to take a look back at this piece that she wrote in 1831-3, sometime at that time, when she wrote a romance, and here's this theme that you see there at the top. Just look at that top line. This theme is important for her relationship to Robert in several ways. One of them is that Robert wrote his Opus 5 as a set of impromptus on a theme by Clara Wieck, and this was that theme that was referenced there. So Robert wrote this very large set of variations focused on this, this one theme. Then when you get to the variation set at the very end, you still have Robert's theme happening, but hers is so cleverly and just perfectly interspersed that it's there, mixed in. I made a different engraving of it underneath so you can see it a little bit clearer, even though it's smaller, so maybe defeats the purpose. But you can see that she's woven it in a way that's going to be, this is going to be extremely meaningful to her and him. I don't know that, somebody playing this set when it was published, I think it was, it might have been published posthumously, 1856 after Robert's death, I can't remember. But anyway, it might not have been so obvious to them, but it was made clear to Brahms, who also decided to include this in his own set of variations on the same theme that he did in honor of the Schumann family that he had just gotten to know just before, unfortunately, the tragic end of Robert Schumann's life, where he tried to commit suicide and ended up spending 2.5 years in a sanatorium. In any case, it's a sort of just a mesmerizing and transformative work, and it's kind of just shows what she was up to and where she was going. And unfortunately, after the Opus 23, she didn't really compose much more. There are a couple of things here and there, but she didn't really continue composing after Robert's death. Lots of different reasons why that might be, but unfortunately not. So you're going to really enjoy this piece, I believe, if you don't know it. We won't really have time to go over the three romances. These will open the work, but open the concert tonight. But it's a set of three works that share a similar sort of arch to the Opus 22 romances for violin and piano, in that there's almost like a bard strumming a harp or something while accompanying this music. At least in there's some of the, this writing is a little bit awkward for the piano in that these giant leaps and whatnot. So it makes me feel like it's meant to have a sort of oracular component to it. She does a lot of things that are, your typical composer tricks, but done in a clever way, where the inner themes are related to the primary theme, and that comes up. And then she also has a few tricky rhythms, like 12 against 5 and whatnot, that come into play. The second romance is an interesting one. It's a bit of a mystery in some ways. It's a much more minimalist sort of piece, and so it's a kind of I think of it as something of a palate cleanser. The third one is a much more agitato work that, again, you'll enjoy. I think it kind of creates this, even though it's not a sonata or something like that, it feels like a natural grouping of these works. I'll say just a word about the songs and the violin pieces that we're going to be hearing as well. There's a selection of 6 songs that we're going to hear, and they sound amazing. I got to hear them again earlier, so I already know what's in store for you. One of the interesting ones is the set that we think of as the Opus 12 of Clara Schumann, which is a group of 3 songs that were actually published as part of, it's actually labeled Opus 37/12, published by Robert as a gift given to Clara on her birthday, after they had composed these as a joint work on poems by Friedrich Ruchert on the joys of married love, basically. And so she contributed 3 to the dozen songs. In my opinion, they're the strongest ones, and they're quite something. She was no fan of Franz Liszt, at least she originally was, but then had a falling out with him. But Liszt took one of these songs and did a transcription of it. He did also 2 other transcriptions, including another one that we're going to hear tonight. They're just lovely works. We already looked a little bit at Eriska Komen, but the other 2 are just I feel like they're gems too, and they should be performed as well. Then we get to the Opus 23 songs set to poetry by Hermann Rollet. And this was an interesting, a lot of people don't think very highly of him as a author, but I think Robert was reading this novel, Yukunda, and mentioned that these were musically interesting pieces, and Clara took him up on it and started to write these excellent songs based on this maybe not great poetry. But just like Brahms would say, it's not, sometimes it's better just to have, and this is not quoting, but it's better to have a subpar poet that you can elevate versus having trying to take the best and then making it worse. So she does this really wonderful work with these, and we'll hear two of those songs as well. Again, one of those the Library of Congress has as a holograph manuscript in her hand. Another one that we'll hear is from 1843. That is her setting of the Lorelei, the Heine poem that everybody said in the 19th century. It's unclear why she didn't publish this work. I don't know why. It's got echoes of Errol König and other things, so I think that you'll enjoy the piece. And it's really, it's a kind of a fascinating little piece, but she didn't publish it, so it was only recently published. The other piece the pieces that will close out the first half are the violin and piano romances, and these are one of two pieces that she wrote for pieces of chamber music that she wrote. So what's amazing is that these works are dedicated to Joseph Joachim, who was a friend, and a new friend in 1853 and 1854, when Brahms and he were kind of first becoming integrated into the Schumann household. And as Joachim would grow in stature, of course, he became this great violinist who was looked to by Brahms and others as somebody to talk to about not only how his music should go, but how the playability of the writing. And so it'd be interesting to ask Carrie McDermott, who's performing tonight, what she thinks of it. But there's some extremely effective, at least from my view, sonically, things happening with this writing that it makes one wonder. Again, this is you think a composer would need some practice with this to write something this good right off the bat. So those are a treat, and they're quite substantive works that you'll hear. And then we'll end the program with the trio, which is one of the more performed works of hers, and it's a truly substantial piece that I think that you'll enjoy if you don't know it. And it's one that was, of course, admired by luminaries of the time, and that one dates, it's more from 1846, and the story, one story behind that is that she actually wrote this piece before Robert had attempted to write a piano trio himself. And so I would imagine that might have been one motivating factor for just going for it with this thing where there wouldn't be this sort of comparative sort of, not that there was a competition between them, but so that there would be something new. Of course, unfortunately, before the thing was published, Robert started writing his first piano trio and then kind of created this sense of self-doubt. And I think I'm going to end on this note, which is that as so often happened, composers would have this pressure from a domestic and societal pressure that would basically prevent them from doing all that they might have done had they been a man or been in different circumstances. And this affected Clara, I think, deeply, and there's letters and notes in her diaries that show this. She had 8 children in 13 years. She was the primary breadwinner of the house, so she was concertizing constantly when she wasn't confined. And she had circumstances that were, I don't know how she managed it, because when, there's certain times when she finally had her piano of her own, but she couldn't practice when it would disturb Robert's composition. Things like that seem like maybe not such a big deal, but if that's your daily life and you're trying to, practice and make, help your family survive, you're not able to do all the things that you might have wanted to do. But what's fascinating is that she did a lot of this amazing compositional work in the thick of all of this. So, by the time we're in 1853, it's really astounding that she was able to accomplish all this on top of everything else that she was doing. After Robert died, like I said, she didn't really continue with composition, but that was partly because she was dealing with still providing for the family and other subsets of her family, but also dealing with his legacy, which was a voluminous amount of music to edit and to work with Brahms and others to put together for publication. So that became another part of her sort of life work after that. I wish that she had written more music, but I'm so pleased that we're able to hear what we have to hear today, and I think that you're going to enjoy it if you don't know it, and I encourage you to listen to the things that aren't represented on this particular program, and help to kind of bring this stuff back into play. So thank you again for coming, and I hope you enjoy the concert.